We are back. This is episode number 67 of Kalibrated with Scott. I'm Scott, of course. Today, I am joined by the one, the only Brian Berletic. How are you doing, Brian?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah. It is about 4:30 where I'm at. Let's see, actually, closer to 5 now. So AM. So if I stumble and mess up, I do apologize. We got to do these when we can get them in. And today was an early one for me. It's good timing for Brian, though. What time is it there?
It's almost 6 p.m. now. So this is a rare treat for me to do an interview in the middle, kind of like in the middle of my day, so to
Yeah,
speak.
I know you're always doing them either early or super late because of where you live, but I appreciate you coming on. We have a lot to talk about today. We are coming up on 100 days of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and we have not seen a lot of progress. There's a lot of talk of progress from people like Kirby and other U.S. officials and European officials, but in totality on the ground, we're not seeing very much progress. Uh, do you expect that the Ukrainians, as they say, will continue this offensive into the winter? Do you think that it's more realistic, as Washington has put it, that the offensive will culminate in 4 to 6 weeks? That's how I see it. I've been saying that for about 3 or 4 weeks now, that the Ukrainians are on the clock. They have about a month left, 30, 40 days before the ground just liquefies with mud, and you're restricted to road movement. How do you see the Ukrainians going about this? How do you see force disposition in the region, and what do you think is going to happen?
That's all really important questions. Now, we had been talking for months before Ukraine started the offensive, talking about the different clocks that would be ticking once they started. The weather is one of them, and so that means toward the end of October. But then there was also the artillery ammunition, and apparently they honestly thought that they were going to make a breakthrough much earlier on and that this would be over much sooner for some reason, and I don't know what that reason actually is. So they realized that it wasn't happening, and they rushed these cluster munitions, 155 millimeter cluster shells, to Ukraine to give them more time on that clock. That's probably going to last them also until the end of October. And Scott, in a recent live stream on my channel, you cited CNN, which was talking about Ukraine firing only 2,000 to 3,000 rounds a day. That is half of what they had been firing over the course of the special military operation. And of course, that is a fraction of what Russia is firing. So this is a huge problem. This is probably the biggest limiting factor, other than trained manpower, that Ukraine is facing. Trained manpower is going to be very difficult for Ukraine to regenerate. This artillery shell production problem is a problem I think that they're not actually going to be able to solve. So the offensive clearly failed. Even if they were to make a breakthrough and reach the Sea of Azov this week, they wouldn't have anything left of their army. They're going to be right back to where they were at the end of their fall offensive last year, completely depleted and waiting for NATO to transfer another army's worth of men and machines. And does NATO even have the capacity to do that at this point? I would say no. They're already talking about the next wave of weapons that they're trying to scrape together, and they're Leopard 1 tanks. They're taking tanks out of museums to train Ukrainians on the Leopard 1. The Leopard 1 is incredibly inadequate compared to the Leopard 2, and that didn't help them at all. So, it's a disaster, and we predicted that it would be a disaster for all of these reasons. And it's just a matter of how the West is going to come to grips with it and what they're going to start thinking about doing next, because I don't see what else they could do. I don't even see another offensive in the cards in the future for them. I also don't see them backing down. So it really is. It just looks like they'll try to find something else that they can do to escalate.
And one of those things that they can do to escalate, or I would say not even escalation so much as just distraction, because that's what it seems like most of what's going on is they're trying to pull focus anywhere except the battlefield. And we've seen that through drone attacks on the Russian airfield up in the north. We've seen drone attacks continue on Moscow and other regions of Russia. We've also seen something very particularly interesting that I just do not understand at all. And I wanted your opinion on it. We actually saw it this morning. Ukrainian intelligence operatives with the Ukrainian Intelligence Bureau going out on these little speedboats and touching down in Crimea, or on today they touched down at an oil rig, an abandoned oil rig somewhere in the Black Sea. They claim Russia has controlled it since they took over Crimea in 2014. They plant a flag, they take some pictures, and then they leave. What sense do you make of these operations? And is it just a distraction? Is there something they're actually getting out of this? Because I can't seem to find the answer.
Well, it's exactly that. It's a distraction. It is a substitute for actual gains on the battlefield. It is a substitute for the ability to strategically change the situation at all. Of course, none of these stunts that they pull have any strategic meaning, often not even a local tactical meaning. When they're doing these things to humiliate or upset Russia, is only going to galvanize the Russian people further around the Russian government and the special military operation. It may give a morale boost to people in Ukraine or people who are cheering on Ukraine, but it's a way of keeping them in this fantasy world that they all lived in up to the point where the offensive was launched, where they all honestly thought that there was a chance of it succeeding. So it's delaying the inevitable, but only in their minds. On the ground, they just step closer and closer toward catastrophe as each day goes by.
When do you think that realization is going to dawn on at least the pro-Ukrainian information space? The people in Washington seem to still be in some sort of, I don't know, alternate reality where the intelligence they're being given is either provided by Ukraine or by people who are supporting the Ukraine project. That seems to be the case all over the place. You hear people talk, and it's like either they're outright lying, which they very well could be, these politicians in these certain positions, or they are actually under the impression that things are going better than they are. My first question would be, which do you think it is? Do you think that they understand and they're just trying to continue this, or do you think that they actually believe what they're saying? And then my second question is, when do you think that realization will dawn? When do you think the disillusionment will start to come in? Will that be after this counteroffensive sort of wraps up, when the mud becomes an issue? Do you think that's going to be 2025? Like, how long do you think this narrative can keep digging itself deeper?
I think it's a combination of people lying, or they see things that they don't like, so they try to rationalize it in their head rather than face the truth. It might not be overt dishonesty. It might be, I don't want to believe that that's true, so let me try to make up a story in my head as to why I'm seeing this, and it does not equate to Ukraine losing. I think there's a lot of that, and I don't think that they're ever going to come to grips with it. A lot of these people, especially people who are still insisting that the offensive is going as planned, there's still people actually out there doing that. Look at the Vietnam War. There's Americans who still honestly believe that, oh, if you look at it a certain way, we actually won it. I mean, no, you didn't. And the same for Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. And I think this will just be the next American military project that failed, that they're still going to spin years from now. Actually, when you think about it, we delivered a strategic defeat to Russia. We won, even though they didn't, and they didn't. So I think it'll be a long time. And some of these people, no, not at all.
Yeah, which is pretty. It's an impressive way to fool yourself when you think about it, because the way it looks right now, at least, Russia is not losing any of the territory it currently controls. This was what I would consider probably the last big offensive that the Ukrainians are going to be able to go on. Russia's pressure just continues to increase. Ukraine is not going to be receiving. I mean, I don't think Ukraine is going to be receiving an army of this caliber ever again, in terms of trained manpower, in particular. I haven't even seen any large training programs going on in Europe right now, which would be very concerning for me if I was, somebody in the pro-Ukrainian information space or in the Ukrainian government or in the Ukrainian military, because, you have to have these constant reserves being pumped into your system, especially when you're on the offensive and you're burning through manpower faster than you're gaining it. So, the lack of this new, I guess what I would say is that it doesn't seem like mobilization is going as well as it should be right now. They're talking about bringing people back from European countries, Ukrainians that have left the country at the beginning of the SMO and throughout the war, telling them to come back. They've also closed the borders for women to leave now. So basically nobody can leave the country. Do you see this being to the very last Ukrainian sort of fight? Is that what we're going to be dealing with here? And do you think the Russians are prepared for that sort of slog?
Yes, well, Russia is prepared for it. We could get into that a little bit here in just a moment. But when you start doing things like this, you start resorting to desperate measures to mobilize additional manpower. And you were talking about these NATO training programs across Europe. There are pro-Ukrainian analysts who now admit that those training programs were utter failures, that these programs, no matter how long you keep them going, are not going to produce the type of forces you need to achieve the objectives that Ukraine seeks to achieve. You cannot stand up entire brigades in just a couple of months. That is impossible. I would say, look, NATO was training Ukrainian forces since 2014 for 8 years before the special military operation. These same analysts who are now admitting these NATO training programs for this current conflict, that those aren't working, they admit that force that was built up over the course of 8 years, that's gone. That has been eliminated. There is no sizable portion of that NATO trained force on the battlefield in Ukraine right now. So if 8 years wasn't enough, 2 or 3 months certainly isn't enough, and no amount of training or shifting the deck chairs around on the Titanic is going to change what is happening. It is a disaster, and there's nothing they can do with the amount of time and the resources that they have. They're going to try to build up another army just like they did the last 3 times if you count from 2014 to 2022. They're going to do that again, but it isn't working. Clearly it's not working. And then there are other factors that continue to degrade that cannot be reconstituted as this continues. The air defenses, for example, people are saying Ukraine needs more air defenses. Of course they do. Where are you going to get them from? That is something the West is out of, and they have no ability to produce in the numbers needed for this conflict. So again, all of these clocks were ticking. People who were paying attention to them understood the reality of where this conflict was going, and people who ignored them or who pinned their hopes on wonder weapons, they missed this. They're still missing it. Some of them are waking up to it. Will it be enough to change policy in a rational direction? I think not.
Yeah. When it comes to the training that the NATO partners were doing for Ukraine, does this make you, when you're talking about your analysis of potential NATO conflict in the future, wherever that may be, if NATO is going up against a near peer, does this make you step back and consider the possibility that perhaps NATO standard training needs to be updated in some way? Because the way that NATO wanted Ukraine to attack Russia in the south ended up failing horribly and then being translated into, you know, Ukraine doing their own thing with Western weapons and being more successful, using more infantry tactics, less, you know, armored assaults and stuff like this. You know, I know that NATO would be have air power advantage, but if you're going up against a near peer who has some sort of air defense, I think if Ukraine, you know, if NATO was actually fighting Ukraine, just in a hypothetical, with the amount of air defense that the Ukrainians had at the beginning of the conflict, the US would be in a difficult position because it wouldn't be able to use its air power to the extent that it would want to. Obviously, they have better, you know, a better air force than the Russian military because that's what they solely focus on, but lacking that large ground force that the Russians have, lacking the industrial base that the Russians have. Do you think that NATO really needs to take a step back and analyze what happened in Ukraine and try to change their combined arms tactics around what the lessons that they learned?
That's actually a very interesting question. And when you listen to Western analysts, they're like, look, when the United States invaded Iraq and we got to Baghdad in X number of days, and what's Russia's problem in Ukraine? How embarrassing. But when you think about it, Ukraine is geographically larger than Iraq. Its population is larger than Iraq's. Its military was larger, better trained, better equipped. As you point out, they had a modern air defense network, integrated air defense network.
One of the best in the world, by the way. It was Russian.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it was older than the equipment that Russia is operating, but everything Russia is operating today is was an advanced version of what Ukraine had.
Yeah.
And so if the US, for example, when it, just as you say, if they were the ones fighting Ukraine, it would have been catastrophic for them. They don't have the artillery that Russia has, that Russia used to good effect to make the progress that they have made. So it would have been a disaster for the US. Their air power would have been paralyzed. They probably would have attempted to use it in the opening phases, and they would have lost more aircraft. And I think Americans would have been ready to accept losing. And yes, they're going to have to rethink the way they wage war entirely. And actually, if you look at planning, military planners in the West, in the United States, they're talking about this. They understand anti-access area denial technology that Russia and China have, and they understand the necessity to be able to breach that and the inability of being able to do that with their current force configuration. It was a force designed to go around the developed world and wipe out countries that don't even have standing armies. That's what the US military was built up around over the last couple of decades. So yes, they have to redesign their entire force. They have to revamp their military industrial base. This is going to take years and years to do. This is not something they can do in the middle of this conflict in Ukraine. And I don't think that it's anything that they can achieve before China irreversibly surpasses the US and the rest of G7. So they missed their moment. I think they missed their moment. And we were talking about this behind the scenes about the difference between the military industrial bases in, say, China or Russia, and then in the United States, how it's purpose-driven versus profit-driven. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, they're not going to have a factory 3 times bigger than they need it to be just in case they need to ramp up production. That is a waste of money. That cuts into their profits. Their goal is maximizing profits, not preparing for a future war. So, you know, this is a huge problem, systemic problem that you have to fix first, and then you have to spend the years, you know, that are necessary to then build out your industrial base the way it needs to be to win these type of conflicts. So, yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think people should really think about that.
And I always like to bark at this, the fact that the US does not have the industrial base. It does not exist. Like, Russia had a huge industrial base that it just basically had to flip a switch, turn it on, get it all booted up, train employees, and then 6 months to a year, you have basically your military industrial complex is on a semi-war footing, right? Your production is exponentially increased. You have the resources to produce all this stuff and get it out to the front lines. The US does not have this. So they have to physically build these new factories. And if you are building this new factory based on a contract of a promise of future payment for something like a delivery of ammunition to Ukraine, and you're looking at this counteroffensive right now, and you're going, the Ukrainians didn't do anything. Everybody's starting to get, cold feet about this. You can hear it, the language shifting. You see the articles coming out, whether, you believe them or not, whatever intel you have, are you really going to take that business risk of building this factory and then being left with the bill of the factory if that order gets canceled because negotiations happen in Ukraine or the regime collapses in Ukraine, and then the whole conflict is over and now you don't need these shells anymore? I mean, maybe the US still wants these shells for the future, but when you're analyzing a conflict like this, just take a step back and look and see if any orders have been put in. There have been no additional orders for air defense. There have been no additional orders for radar. A lot of the systems that are highly, highly required for these operations just are not being produced. And so whatever Ukraine is getting and expending, that's it. That is not it's not going to be reinforced with anything anytime soon. So I think that's something that people miss a lot, and they like to talk about, oh, the US is going to be producing X amount of shells by 2025. It's like, yeah, if the level of intensity of combat continues and if the war continues in this direction, or if there's another war, perhaps. But if this ends in 2024, why would you need to keep producing more shells into 2025? The company's just going to be losing money if that's just sitting in storage. So I think that that's something that people need to think about. I wanted to step back real fast and ask you some questions about some of the things we talked about earlier. We talked about the cluster munition deliveries. Have you seen these cluster munitions actually making any difference on the front line? They were kind of presented as a Wunder Waffe for the Ukrainians. Again, everything that gets delivered from the West is some magical, game-changing weapon. I mean, they were touting about this for weeks and weeks about how it was going to tear up Russian fortifications, how it was going to do all this damage. Have you actually seen any, you can even call it anecdotal if you'd like, evidence through videos and combat footage of this weapon system actually benefiting the Ukrainians? And does it do more than, a standard HE shell now that we've had time to observe it in combat?
It's only useful if troops are out in the open. So if they're targeting, say, a Russian artillery position, then yes, maybe it would be a little bit more useful than high explosive, maybe. But other than that, no, because they're trying to shell fortifications. Fortifications, you want to use high explosive rounds. And if you're trying to use cluster munitions to do that, then it's not going to work. Maybe the rationale was if you do find a target that is out in the open, use the cluster munitions, save your high explosive rounds for fortifications. But in reality, this isn't going to give you a capability you didn't have before. What this is going to do is just stretch out your artillery ammunition a little bit, just a little bit. It is not a solution. It is a stopgap, and there is no solution on the other end of that. So I've heard a lot of people say, well, the cluster munitions are just being sent until high explosive shells, that production is expanded. But just as you say, at the earliest, it'll be 2025, at the earliest. And that is 85,000 shells a month, which is half of what Ukraine was firing per day. And what they were firing per day was still a fraction of what Russia was firing every single day. So is that a solution? Even in the long term, is that a solution? The answer is no.
And when you're talking about those 85,000 shells a month, you have to also remember that the US has to replenish its own stockpiles. It needs to replenish the stockpiles of its allies in South Korea and Israel, who it's borrowed from. And it has to also prepare for its own future conflicts. That's always the downside of being a proxy, is if something else is to rear its head, you become secondary, tertiary, and that conflict could potentially become the primary focus of your proxier. So that is also something to take into consideration when you're talking about total shell production or something like that. And just something that I wanted to touch on really quick, and I know the audience wants to hear about it. There's been a lot of rumors that ATACMS is going to be delivered to Ukraine. We've heard this a bunch since, I mean, basically, I think May 2022. Ukraine's going to get ATACMS. The second HIMARS was delivered. This was something that was on the wish list for Ukraine. I mean, obviously, too little, too late. Why not deliver these earlier? Outside of being afraid of escalation, and let me just ask: does this weapon make a difference on the battlefield? Will this weapon be delivered in a high enough number to make a difference, even if 100% of the strikes hit?
No, it's not going to make any difference. Just like the HIMARS and the Storm Shadow made absolutely no difference. And this is what I don't understand. People who are demanding ATACMS be sent to Ukraine. What do they imagine is going to happen? There were only 38 HIMARS systems sent to Ukraine in the first place. A lot of those are gone. I was reading a CNN article talking about how Russia has figured out a way to jam the guided rockets that HIMARS normally fires, 6 per vehicle. They're firing 18 rockets per day. 18 rockets per day. So do people imagine that Ukraine has all 38 launchers and they're only firing 18 a day? Is that what people imagine? There's some sort of limit there. Either the rockets are in short supply or the vehicles have been destroyed. They have a small number of vehicles, and this is all they can manage to do in a single day. I talked about how the HIMARS has 6 rockets. It goes out into its position, and then it needs to reload, and reloading takes a long time and requires another vehicle, maybe 2 other vehicles, or a number of vehicles. This is something that Russian drones will be able to see, and they'll be able to zero in on that position and destroy it, which means the HIMARS does its mission. It has to go way, way back, out of range of everything that Russia has, find a place to do that, and then come back. This is why they're limited to 18 rockets a day. The ATACMS is a single missile. The HIMARS can only launch 1 at a time, which means that is 1 less vehicle that you have to launch the 6 rockets with. And it's going to launch its missile, and then it's going to have to do its reloading. So no, it's going to be even less per day. And this is very similar to the Storm Shadow in terms of range. Russia's already intercepting Storm Shadows. They've already organized their front line, the rear, anticipating these type of weapons. They've dispersed, they've hardened, they've moved things way, way back beyond the range of these weapon systems. Plus, they have so much more that they can spare to lose versus Ukraine. People have to remember, the ATACMS is not a capability that Russia doesn't have. They have the Iskander missile system, which has a longer range. It's a more modern system. Russia has more of these. They build the missiles every single month. They're producing a number of missiles. So whatever you're going to achieve with the ATACMS, Russia is going to achieve more with their Iskander. Then remember, Russia also has its own guided missile system, like the HIMARS, the Tornado S. They also have cruise missiles with much longer ranges than anything that Ukraine has or will ever receive from its allies. And they have huge numbers of these cruise missiles. Then they have the Garan 2 drone. So and they have military aviation. So as you look at all the capabilities Russia has and the quantities involved with each one of these capabilities, no, the ATACMS isn't going to make a difference, because whatever the ATACMS can do to Russia, Russia could do to Ukraine on a much larger scale.
And for anybody thinking like, oh, well, maybe it will make a difference, just look at what the Storm Shadow did. The Storm Shadow was probably delivered in about the exact same numbers that the ATACMS is going to be delivered in. A cruise missile is much more difficult to intercept than a ballistic missile. So at least in the beginning phases, a ballistic missile travels on a ballistic trajectory, so it's much more predictable than a cruise missile. And the Storm Shadow did nothing. I mean, we saw maybe 2 or 3 successful large strikes with the Storm Shadow. Most of them were small ammunition depots or putting potholes in, bridges around Crimea. I mean, that was pretty much it. So if the Storm Shadow couldn't do anything, the ATACMS is going to do just as much, if not less. And, it's also being delivered at a time when the Ukrainian counteroffensive is culminating. So it's not being delivered at the right time. It just seems like a big mess. I don't know if it's even going to get delivered. I think that this is just a hope right now, and people are talking about it to try to maybe put out feelers and see how the Russians react to it, how the Ukrainians react to it, how the information space reacts to it. But it just, once again, it seems like dribbling in equipment because you have no other options, and just desperation at the end of the day. I wanted to move away from the actual conflict in Ukraine now, and I wanted to talk to you about the recent G20 summit that we had, that we saw. Obviously, Putin and Xi did not go for their own individual reasons. Putin, because of I believe because of the ICC warrant, which, I don't think Putin is necessarily scared about that, but I also don't think he's wanting to put unnecessary pressure on, people he considers to be at least trading partners, if not potential allies. And even though Putin and Xi weren't there, it does seem to me that they ended up being the winners of the G20 summit. Ukraine came out very harshly against the language that the G20 used to describe the SMO, or the war in Ukraine, or however you like to word it. They wanted something along the lines of Russia's war against Ukraine, an aggressive act. They wanted it talked about in that manner, but it was actually referred to more as Russia's conflict in Ukraine. It's more mutual conflict, and the wording is being rotated and changed around, which also leads me to believe that there will be no terrorist designation put on the Russian Federation anytime soon, which is another thing that Ukraine is hoping for. Along with that, we also see the United States putting heavy pressure on some of the newer BRICS members, the UAE in particular, and I just wanted to get your take on some of that.
Well, the United States sees the relevance of G7 and now G20 evaporating. I think that might have also served as motivation for both President Putin and President Xi Jinping not attending. A lot of people try to spin this as, oh, look, China is not, the president of China is not attending. This is because there are problems between China and India, because they would like to imagine that maybe India will throw itself into the fire of proxy war like Ukraine is against Russia. But no, none of this is true. G20 is irrelevant. BRICS is displacing it. China, Russia, India, they're all BRICS members. So this imagined rift between all of these countries, this is wishful thinking on the West's part. And I believe the US is going to be putting pressure on all of the smaller, newer BRICS members to try to peel them away, to compel them to reverse course, reverse this decision, because they understand that the more nations that join BRICS, there will be a cascading effect. A lot of countries are cooperating with the West, not because they want to, but because they have to, and there's no alternative. BRICS is that alternative, and they understand that the larger and more influential BRICS becomes, the different institutions and monetary mechanisms, financial mechanisms that spin off from it, the more it will enhance multipolarism and the options that nations will have to work their way out from under Western hegemony. So this is a process. I guess this is actually where the real war is taking place, and everything else is smaller battles within that war. And I think we need to keep a very close eye on that, trying to figure out if India was even a signatory of the statute that established the ICC. I think that it may not be, but I think BRICS members avoiding the G20 because they want to put the emphasis on BRICS. G20 is old news. They want to push forward with this new grouping. And why would you continue investing in this old one that you're trying to replace?
That's super interesting. I didn't even think about that. Not attending the G20, sending a message, and rather than not doing it out of fear. Our G20 is more important than this thing. That makes sense. Obviously not the G20, but the BRICS meeting. I got that valuable insight by listening to the Duran, by the way. Okay. That makes sense. I wanted to ask you, did you see the picture? And this is completely anecdotal, but every time I watch these large political meetings where you have people from all over the West and the East coming together, did you see the picture of Modi with Biden? And then did you see the picture of Modi with Lavrov? It's like it's like two different worlds.
Yes.
I don't get how, like, it's so eye-opening when you see people like Modi and then Lavrov having like a really good time, shaking hands, hugging, laughing together, and then you see Modi with Biden and it's like a somber, a
chore.
Yeah.
It's a chore.
Yeah.
And there was something else interesting. The prospect of India changing its name to, I think it's Bharat, and it's doing this to shed the colonial legacy of the name of India having been a British colony. So I think that was interesting, and that was something that was done right before the G20 was convened.
Yeah.
And then I was talking to you about this before we started recording. U.S. President Joe Biden in Vietnam, and he's at the podium, and he's obviously mentally impaired.
He's not at the podium.
He's not really at the podium, and he was referring to Vietnam and other nations in the region, and he called them third world. And then he tried to correct himself, saying something about the Southern Hemisphere, which makes no sense. And then he was talking about how all of these nations should have access to change. Well, they're already changing in a very good way. So I don't know what change he wants them to have access to. I think we have an idea. Yeah. And it's what I thought was interesting about that was everyone in Washington, in Brussels, and in London think about the rest of the world, that I would say the non-white world, in very negative terms, as inferior, as even subhuman, third world, something separate from us. As Joseph Borrell said, we are the garden, they are the jungle, and they all think it. And every once in a while, and because Joe Biden is mentally impaired, he's not able to keep that to himself. He blabbered it out in public in Vietnam. And what it is a reminder of how the West, the Western elite, the leadership class actually do view the rest of the world. So I hope nations in Southeast Asia are paying attention to that, understand that there is no seat at the table in Washington, in London, or in Brussels. They should really think about the Chinese foreign minister's words about not following Ukraine into some sort of proxy war that the U.S. leads them into, which is exactly what the U.S. is trying to do in Asia, just as it's doing in Eastern Europe.
We get another year, too, of Biden slipping up on stage.
Maybe 4 more years.
Maybe 4 more years. Could you imagine? I don't understand how people could watch him speak and then think this is the guy we want for another 4 years. There's no way he can do another 4 years. It's just not going to happen.
Well, then you'll get Kamala Harris. But the point is, people voted for Joe Biden not because he was the most qualified candidate, but because they hated the other guy more, which tells you your political system in the United States is dysfunctional. That is not how you should be deciding who leads the country. That is completely dysfunctional.
The better of two terrible options is that's what people's thinking was.
Well, it's like picking 38 special or 357. Which one do you want to point at your head and pull the trigger? That's not really a choice if you ask me. Yeah.
And that change that you referred to, Biden talking about change coming to the third world, I'm pretty sure that's in the form of the Endowment for Democracy and then other NGOs being pushed into these countries. So it's not
Yeah,
really the
yeah. Well,
change.
the change that Ukraine has experienced over the
Yeah.
last 8 to 9 years,
Yeah,
that
like
type of change.
minus 15 million population, no
No
economy,
economy.
territory being lost, that sort of change, all that
Yes.
good stuff. So yeah, I totally agree. Uh Was there anything that you wanted to touch on with Thailand, with Southeast Asia, with anywhere actually, anything that you're covering right now?
Yeah, I just want to go back to the conflict in Ukraine real quick.
Yeah,
We were
for sure.
talking about ATACMS and storm shadows, and what Ukraine might end up trying to do with these weapon systems is hit the Crimean Bridge, maybe even somehow destroy it, and then people will see, it was a game changer. When in reality, and as I pointed out many times, the Crimea went to Russia in 2014. The bridge was completed in 2018. The land bridge was established in 2022. That meant the Crimean Peninsula was sustained economically and militarily for years before either one of these bridges, let alone both of them, were established. If Ukraine was able to deny Russia both of these bridges, Russia would still be able to sustain the economy and its military installations on the Crimean Peninsula. So this is something I just want to say, just in case Ukraine manages to do it and they start saying, see, it was a game changer. Just like with the HIMARS and the fighting around Kherson, they claimed that was the HIMARS, the game changer that gave Ukraine, the city of Kherson, when in reality, Russian forces were out fighting Ukraine. They were able to not only resupply their troops despite the bridge being hit multiple times by HIMARS, they're able to retreat without losing anybody. So what does that tell you about what the HIMARS is actually capable of doing, or what any of these missile systems are capable of doing in terms of interdicting logistics? They can complicate it, they can endanger it, but they cannot cut it. That is the reality.
And
There was, yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna say, with the Kherson situation, with the withdrawal, doesn't it make so much sense now when you step back and you're looking at it? Could you imagine them trying to hold off this offensive while still holding that bridgehead? That would be
Exactly.
such a nightmare to deal with. It was the absolute right move, and it's so embarrassing, but it was the perfect decision to be made there.
And it shows you the difference between a nation making decisions based on actual strategy and battlefield outcomes, and someone obsessed with optics and public relations, and how disastrous it is to pursue one over the other.
Yeah.
The other story I wanted to talk about was this claim by Ukrainian military intelligence that Russia has over
Oh yeah.
420,000 troops within territory Ukraine claims is being occupied by Russia. 420,000 troops. If that really is true, if that is how many troops Russia has in theater, then you've thrown your last reserves into your offensive in Zaporozhye, and you haven't even breached the first defense line. You're still fighting in the security zone. What does that tell you about your prospects in the future? And why is Ukrainian military intelligence saying this? And we were speculating, half joking, but maybe it's true. They're saying there's 420,000 Russian troops. What do you want us to do? How are we supposed to fight and defeat them? Maybe that's why they're claiming this. And the Bloomberg article.
Yeah, it was
Go
one of
ahead.
those. It's one of those weird propaganda things where you're trying to figure out, because the Ukrainians have done this in the past where they're talking about a Russian winter offensive or something like that, and then it never really happens, and then they go, "Oh, look, the offensive failed." There's 420,000 troops in theater. And it could be that's why we lost. That's why the counteroffensive didn't go good, right? That's why we had more issues than we thought we were going to. It's getting to this point though where the propaganda is starting to, no matter which way you spin it, isn't good for Ukraine. The Russians either have so many troops and that's why your offensive didn't go good, but that doesn't bode good for you later. It's not like those troops are going to go away. You know, they're there. If it's the opposite of that, and you're making the Russians seem much bigger than they are when they're really smaller, but your offensive is still failing and you're not progressing, that's even worse. The Russians are using less manpower, less equipment, you know, they're taking less attrition, however you want to divvy that up. And you're still not progressing. So I do believe it's one of these propaganda things that just, no matter which way you spin it now, it's not good.
Absolutely. And we did see Russia mobilize 300,000 troops after the Ukrainian fall offensive last year, and they were training them. And where are they? Does Ukraine claim that they worked their way through all of these troops and there's nothing left? Russia has nothing left to man those defensive lines that Ukraine has yet to reach. Is that, because I have seen people seriously try to propose that, and I don't think that there's any credibility to that claim at all, but is that what they honestly think? And now we have Ukrainian military intelligence saying there's 420,000 Russian troops in theater. So it doesn't bode well for, like you say, no matter which way you cut it, it doesn't bode well for Ukraine. And then there was there's other articles about Russia trying to recruit up to 400,000 troops. So that is from March this year. So is that in addition to the 300,000 that they mobilized at the end of last year? I don't know. It just doesn't seem to look very good for Ukraine.
Yeah. I think that this outside of just the counteroffensive, this whole Ukraine project is starting to look like an absolute disaster. I mean, you've invested all of this money, you're not achieving the result of, I mean, if you're looking at it in the most nihilistic way from the Western perspective, maybe not nihilistic, but most evil. I don't know. Maybe objective oriented in attriting the Russian military to the point where they, quote unquote, they can't do this again to another European nation. First off, what a horrible thing to say about Ukraine. We used Ukraine so this doesn't happen to a different, more important European nation, or however you want to spin that. But, they can't do this again. Well, that's not true, because now you have a Russian military that isn't a complete outdated, what I would consider almost a joke. The Russian military that went in 2022 was not utilizing drones, did not have advanced precision guided missiles or bombs. Sorry. You didn't have FPVs. You didn't have the Lancet. You did not have artillery crews that were trained. I mean, like, these artillery crews are now the best in the world, right? They're working day in and day out. That's all they do. Your multiple launch rocket system crews, best in the world. Your pilots are now the most combat trained pilots in the world. Your army is now the sharpened knife that it wasn't when you went in. The Russian army that went in 2022 was what I would consider the U.S. military to be now. A military that had only been used very sparsely in, Syria, like the Russians were, but, in Afghanistan and Iraq, over the last 20 years, there haven't been a lot of large combined arms warfare. It's a very run down and specialized military that isn't going to translate into what you want when you're talking about a large invasion like Russia and Ukraine. And now the Russian military seems like an entirely different beast. It's still slow, in my opinion, to make corrections to things, but it is making corrections, right? And it is improving, and its military industrial base has now come online. And over the next 10 years, after the Ukrainian conflict ends, the Russian military is only going to continue to progressively get stronger. I totally lost my train of thought. Do you?
No, what you were saying was that the West was trying to use this project to weaken Russia. It's done the exact opposite. And I totally agree. Yeah. It's done completely the opposite, just in terms of military industrial production in Russia. We see even the West now admitting it. Do you remember when they were trying to say, they all their equipment is outdated?
Yeah.
Everything is run down. Their economy is going to collapse. Now they're starting to admit that no, Russia is making over 800 new tanks or modernized tanks per year, which is actually something that they were saying before. You have to dig for this information. It's all there. They're lying to themselves to try to convince themselves that this was possible. This whole project was possible when it isn't, and it will have the exact opposite effect. And then just think about how close Russia and China are getting. They were already close. They already had a much larger number of common grounds that people weren't aware of or wish didn't exist. But because of the way the US is trying to encircle and contain both nations, they're working closer together militarily. So all of these lessons that Russia is learning in Ukraine, fighting against NATO equipment, they are explaining all of this to China. China is gaining understanding of this, and China's industrial base is the largest in the world. So there is still a lot of room for this to go even worse for the West if they continue insisting otherwise.
This is what I was literally just about to say was you now have your other adversaries who you consider your enemies in, say, Iran, North Korea, China. They're now, I mean, if you're the US, they're now just sitting back watching how your intelligence apparatus works, watching what your industrial base can do. Your enemies are sitting here watching the NATO alliance have, difficulties agreeing on what weapons to send, how to conduct this operation, how to do this, how to do that. The amount of information being gained is exponentially larger than what the US is learning about. I mean, they're only learning about what Russia does. They're not learning how Iran operates, how China operates, but Iran and China are both learning how to counter the way the US is operating and how they would potentially operate in a future conflict. And I think that's an important thing that people don't often think about. Yes, the West may understand how to fight Russia, but Russia is not supposed to be the West's next big enemy, right? It's China. That's what the people in Washington have been saying, and people in the Pentagon have been saying. We need to turn our focus to China. We need to look to China as the next big pure threat that we're going to be dealing with. And now China has had a year and a half of, oh, this is what we need to do. Oh, we need to do this. Oh, we need to change this about how we operate. Oh, look at the Russians made this mistake when they went in. We need to not make this mistake if we ever go in somewhere. Or if we're, trying to counter something, we need to do this. We've even seen the Chinese have their own Guarantee, the sunflower, which is actually a much greater version of the Guarantee, because the Guarantee is just set on a GPS trajectory and flies in and hits a target, predetermined target. The Chinese version is a hunter. It has high thermal and optic sensors on it, so it's going to be able to select targets by itself or by an operator's choice and hit those targets. I mean, these are just little things that, with China's industrial base, is going to exponentially improve their chances of combating the West in future conflicts. Do you agree with that? I mean, you just kind of said that, but
yes, and the other thing that I thought was interesting is the West, or the United States, announced that they're going to design these drone swarms to take out 1,000 Chinese targets in 24 hours. And this is all ideas that they're coming up with looking at the fighting in Ukraine. And the thing that they forget is that both Ukraine and Russia are buying most of their drones and drone components from where? From China. So do you think that China is going to be sending you components to build this swarm to then destroy China? I don't think so. And I also don't think that you're going to build this swarm and China isn't going to have one 10 times bigger waiting for you when you come.
Or a counter to that drone swarm.
Exactly.
A large electronic warfare network that they're designing, because they've been paying attention to the Ukraine war, and they see how one of the biggest obstacles for the Ukrainian military right now is Lancets and FPVs just tearing up this offensive. I've been saying this for a long time. In the near future, I expect every small squad to have some sort of backpack electronic warfare device. At least one person in a squad is carrying this to prevent these mass casualty events that come from 8 or 9 FPV drones taking out an entire unit. I think that that's going to become very important in the near future, and China is going to be on the cutting edge of that.
Yes, and China is watching the problems that Russia is having with these Ukrainian drones, say hitting that airfield.
Yeah,
it's not a huge problem for Russia. It's not happening anywhere on a scale large enough to impact their combat power, not yet at least. But China is watching that, and they're learning about hardening their military airfields,
yep.
Repairing their airfields, because they're looking at what Russia did to Ukraine's airfields, and they're looking at all of this, and they're just thinking, what if the United States does this to us? How can we repair the airfields quickly and get our warplanes continue operating our warplanes? And so all of these things China gets to watch in relative comfort, not having committed anywhere. They're more or less neutral. They're not overextending themselves. It's the U.S. Now, the ATACMS, the other thing to mention about the ATACMS is that was a weapon system that the U.S. claimed we can't really afford to send to Ukraine because we need this for fighting perhaps in the Pacific. Well, now they're contemplating sending them to Ukraine for exactly the reason you said, Scott. They're out of other things to send that can distract the public, make it look like this, and as long as it takes, is actually they're committed to this. They're not going to have that for the Pacific. They're starting to extend themselves even in terms of this war they want to provoke with China. China's not in that situation yet, and they're not going to. All they're going to do with their time and their energy in terms of military capabilities is invest it in from the lessons that they learned in Ukraine.
Yeah. I think that the West is entering into a radically changing world. And I think that it's going to become more hostile to the West. It's going to pull away from the West further and further. And I mean, it's their own doing, right? They could have approached this with better foreign policy. They could have made allies instead of enemies all over the map, and instead they chose the route that benefits the military industrial complex in the short term. So I see this progressively becoming worse and worse for the West. I think if they would have negotiated right after the Kharkov and Kherson offensives that Ukraine went on, I think that would have been the best time. They could have really maybe potentially come out of this with some sort of win, but instead they pushed it, and now it's just going to continue going downhill. And I don't know how they explain their way out of it when it eventually does collapse, because eventually it's going, the money is going to stop coming in eventually. It's not the gravy train will end.
Well, just think about it. If they stuck to the Minsk agreements, they would have maintained all, as far as Ukraine's concerned, they would have maintained all of their territory except for Crimea. And imagine if they didn't go along with a US-backed coup in 2014, they still would have had Crimea. And this is the problem with proxy conflicts. The US is fighting this conflict with Russia through Ukraine, spending Ukrainian blood, territory, infrastructure, economy, blood, human lives, everything. There's no incentive for the U.S. to stop because they're not paying the price. Ukraine is paying the price. And this was a point that Professor John Mersheimer made in a discussion he was having with Glenn Deason and Alexander Mercouris. They have no incentive to stop. What for what purpose? It's going to have to get a lot worse for the United States and the European Union economically, and in terms of geopolitics. It's going to have to get a lot worse. They'll continue doing this, just as you say. It's going to get worse and worse for them. They'll become more and more isolated, and eventually the conditions on the ground around the world are going to prevent them from doing business this way. It's not that they're going to be compelled to stop. They just physically won't be able to. And I think that is the job for multipolarism right now, is to create a world that the West can no longer pursue a foreign policy like this and in this way anywhere else.
Yeah.
after what they've done to Ukraine and, of course, the Middle East, North Africa, all of Africa, Central Asia, South America, like the entire planet, basically.
Yeah. Everybody's turning away. And we see that, I mean, BRICS has expanded. It's now the BRICS 11. So whatever the name is going to change to. Also, also I was thinking if BRICS, if India changes its name, it's not going to be BRICS anymore. It's going to be
That's true.
BRICS. So
that's true. That's true. That's
but we'll see what happens. They might have to get creative with that, but who knows? I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up. That was a good hour conversation. Brian, where can people find you? What do you got going on? Where's the best way for people to support you?
Just go to YouTube, type in the new Atlas, and then in the video description under each one of my videos are all the other places you can find and follow me. I'm on Telegram. That is the primary place I post absolutely everything from links to videos to actual full-length videos as a backup for YouTube, articles, everything else, even daily observations. I'm on Twitter, but I primarily post on Telegram first and foremost. So if you go there, you will see that. You'll also see all the links to support my work if you want to. And yeah.
Have you edited your Telegram link
No,
yet?
I can't figure out how to do that. It's called Brian Loves Thailand, something like that. And that's because I'm based in Thailand, and I had been focused primarily on Thailand and Southeast Asia. And I had a fan club on Telegram, and they made up this Telegram channel that was getting popular, and then they very graciously handed it over to me, which I greatly appreciated. But it's a fan club address. It's not really, it should be the new Atlas, but it's okay. Just go to YouTube in the video description where it says Telegram, just click on that link and it'll lead you there.
And I'll have it in my description of my video as well. So go down and follow us.
Thank you.
Yes, also follow Brian on Twitter. He's not on there all the time, but he does comment some funny things when people
small doses. Yeah, I can only take Twitter in small doses.
When people say really stupid things, Brian can sometimes be found underneath correcting. So it's a good time. Also, if you guys like my work, if you want to support me, follow me on Twitter, Telegram, subscribe and like this video. That's the easiest way you can support me. And if you want access to some exclusive content and interviews, support me on Patreon. I know it's money, and if you don't have it, that's okay. All of the important content will be free. All of the big videos, like videos with Brian and other large content creators, will always be free on YouTube. So, any way you can support me is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone.